I'm joined today by Dr. Harish Madabushi, Assistant Professor in Artificial Intelligence at University of Bath. Your work made the news a couple months ago with headlines about AI posing no existential threat to humanity based on the paper you co-authored on emergent abilities in large language models. I have some questions on that, but before going specific into it, maybe you can speak a little bit more about, your research. What does a professor in AI do nowadays?
Yeah, I think, so I'm a lecturer at the University of Bath, and I focus on artificial intelligence. And my focus has always been in language and extracting insights from language. And it's been very exciting the last 5 years, because for the first time, we can do some very exciting things that were very, very difficult to do, just as recently as like 2016 and so on. And I think we're in the middle, or we're at the start of a very fundamental change in the way we work with language. And that, to me, is very exciting. And the second part of your question, in terms of what does an AI researcher do? Well, we do teach. I teach the NLP module, which has about 150 students in it, because it's very popular now. And it's very exciting to see young people really excited about NLP and what the potential is and what that means to them going into industry. And the other part of what I work on, my research, is focused on two aspects. One is understanding exactly what large language models can do, which is a really hard thing, because they're trained on these massive data sets to kind of differentiate what it is that they have access to, and what they are able to reason about is a difficult thing. And that's one of my focus areas. The second part is using what we've learned there. We try to build smaller, more tractable models, which are explainable and also as effective, hopefully, as some of the larger models. So this involves things like adding explicit memory into a large language model and what that would involve. So you don't have to retrain the model when there's an election. Instead, you just update some information, and based on that, they can work with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the paper you published recently, you looked at the emergent abilities of large language models. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that concept. What exactly are emergent abilities?
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. So I think emergent abilities are, the notion of emergence is very interesting. And I think there's a lot of debate, because large language models can do something fundamentally different from everything else before them. So what is it that they can do? Well, previously, if you had to work with a particular problem, let's say you want to predict stock trends, you want to kind of understand whether a movie will do well in once it's released or not, you collect a whole host of data. You'll have experts annotate it. You'll say, this is a good movie, this is a bad movie for these reasons. And then you'd feed that into a machine learning algorithm, and we'd train these several times over, hyperparameter optimization and so on. And then you could use them on new examples that they haven't seen before. There would be some extrapolation, they have to stay within domain and so on, but that was what was required. But what large language models allow is something fundamentally different. So for the first time, you're able to train on a relatively easy task to understand English, and then use it on a difficult task, such as, understanding whether the movie is going to do well or not. And the simple task is just the task of auto-completion. It's like what you see on your phone, auto-completion. So you just train on this task of auto-completion, and you get the model to become really good at it. But what was really interesting is people did this just to get it to understand language, so we can then transfer it over to other tasks. But they found that just that was enough. We didn't have to actually train it on a different task. Just training it on enough of this auto-completion would mean that all of a sudden it was able to solve a host of tasks that it wasn't trained on. And that is fundamentally different from everything we've seen before, because previously we had to train on individual tasks. And now this leads to a problem, which is, if I can now find a host of tasks that it can solve with just this auto-completion, what if we make these models bigger, as we are bound to do, because we're still at the start of this revolution? What happens in the future when these models become even bigger, trained on even more data, trained on video data? Are they suddenly able to come together and plan and strategize, long-term strategization and so on? And will that lead to these models colluding against us? And this is the extreme end of what it is that these models could reach. And this isn't a fringe idea. This is a fairly central and fairly important idea to look at. This was discussed by Geoffrey Hinton, who's a British computer scientist, who very recently won the Nobel for physics for exactly this idea of backpropagation, which is at the heart of everything we do in terms of machine learning. So there's some very prominent scientists who are very worried about this. And the idea for this comes from this notion that these models can solve certain tasks automatically. And our exploration really was trying to understand what that is. Like, can they actually do this? Is there a way we can explain what it is that these models are doing? And would that explanation allow us to better understand what models can and can't do? And are there limits to what they can do, which will then help us decide on whether they do pose an existential threat, but that is the catchphrase of where we're heading. But importantly, what does that tell us about the ways in which we should use these models and the ways in which we should not? The domains where we should use these models and the domains that we should not. And I think that's the distinction that we were making. So just to quickly summarize what it is that we did, we ran a host of experiments on a range of models, starting from GPT-2 going all the way up to GPT 3.5, which is a very large model, 175 billion parameters. And our experiments were in trying to understand whether there's a link between what we know models do, and I'll say a little bit more about what it is that we know about what they do, and these so-called emergent abilities. So what is this, theory-backed mechanism that we do understand, and how can we extend it to these new capabilities that seem to be emergent? So the theory-backed kind of notion of how these models work is rooted in what's called in-context learning. But what that really means in very simple language is that once you train this model on this auto-completion task, if you ask that model a question, it's not able to immediately answer that question. So because it's trained to just complete things. And when you see a question, typically it's followed by several other questions. So the model will auto-complete a question with other questions that look like it. So the way to get it to respond to us, there's two ways to do that. One is to provide it with a couple of examples of the kind of response that we require from it. So you give it a question and you give it an answer to that question. In the same domain, you would give it a second question, another answer, and finally the question that you're interested in getting an answer to. So specifically, if it's about the movies we were talking about, you'd say, here's a movie, here's a description of the movie, it did well. Here's another movie, description of that movie, it didn't do well. Here's a new movie, here's what this description is. Can you tell me whether it's going to do well or not? And that is something that these models can answer, because now you've kind of conditioned it to sift through information in a particular, very specific way. Now, the second dimension in which you can interact with these models is after they've been trained to interact in this chat-like systems. And that is, it's only when we train them to act in this chat-like system do these emergent abilities emerge. Before that, they are not actually present, except when we test them in this example-like settings where we give them examples. So our work is in linking these two dimensions. It's to say, essentially, once you train the model to understand instructions, what they're able to do is fundamentally the same as what they would do before that if you were to provide them with examples. And that has consequences, because when you provide a model with very clear examples and allow it to complete those examples and solve a task based on those examples, what you're doing is very clearly guiding the model. At every stage, you must guide this model. And there is no scenario in which the model would just, do something that's completely unexpected. And that's because it's not in that exemplars that we provide to the model. And it's very easy to understand that when we think about it in the context of these examples. Whereas when we look at it, once the model has been trained to understand instructions, it becomes complicated, because you can just ask the model, here's a movie review, tell me whether it's going to do well or not. Or here's a movie description, tell me. And now it gets tricky, because if it can interact with you in that level, maybe it can do something else. But by linking that to the example-like interaction, we're showing that is not the case. It is not going to be able to do things completely independent. It is based on the prompts that we provide. And when those prompts are very explicit and detailed in terms of what we require of them, if it's a multi-step complex reasoning problem, if we describe all of the intermediary steps, it will be able to solve it for us. In most cases, or in some cases, it will fail because the problem is still too complex. But if our prompt is very generic and very kind of superficial, then the model will just go back into this auto-completion task, wherein it will complete it with the most likely token, which is when it does what's called hallucination, which is it generates output that's not in sync with reality. And this explains our mechanism, also explains why large language models require prompt optimization, because the alternative hypothesis that these models are, let's say, intelligent would mean that regardless of how I ask them a question, what my prompt said exactly, it wouldn't matter, because a truly intelligent system would be able to decipher that and very easily give me an answer. The fact that it isn't able to do that means that it's using this underlying mechanism of example generation. So very explicitly, what that means is, if you can think of your prompt as something that's going to create those examples, and of course the model doesn't do this internally, but if we think of it that way, then we can then decipher how to prompt these models in effective ways, and we call that implicit in context learning. And what does that translate to? Well, it says that if we're going to be in domains that are, low resource domains that are not commonly used on the internet and found on the internet, we need to be careful. For example, the medical domain and so on, because if we prompt and ask for information in that, there's relatively less priors in the pre-training data that it can draw from. It's not memorizing, it's not regurgitating what it saw in pre-training, it is generalizing based on pre-training data. So it's extracting priors from the pre-training corpus and using that to answer the question. And therefore, if those priors aren't present, then it's not going to do a very good job. And that is really the crux of what it is that we propose, showing that these models do not pose an existential threat because they're user-guided, and also providing a template for how we can effectively interact with them.
All right. You touched on something that, and when I was reading your paper, I know this sentence kind of stood out to me. I'm just going to quickly go over it. It says, the assumption that LLMs have access to emergent functional linguistic abilities significantly affect the way in which users interact with and use these systems. Over-reliance on these perceived abilities can lead users to provide insufficient detailed instructions, potentially resulting in hallucinations and errors. You're just alluding to this, right? And a lot of the things that I hear sometimes with people that we've worked with is that, hey, LLMs are unreliable. We never know when they're going to be hallucinating, right? And it seems like you're pointing here. Okay, here's the reason why. It's not they're unreliable. It's that people might not be working the right way with them. Yeah. I'm curious to hear, maybe expand a little bit more on this concept in the sense of, hey, can they end up doing more damage than good if people just go into them without, I guess, the proper training or understanding on how they work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, the way I see it is that until recently, machine learning was accessible to a very select few people. It required training. It required people going through some very formal kind of education to be able to take data, train it, and extract insights from it. And that is not necessarily a good thing. And the fact that ChatGPT and systems like this democratize this is fantastic. And now it's accessible to a range of people. But like you said, the issue, the other side to this problem is that now everyone can access it. And if you haven't thought about what it is that the consequences for this are, then it becomes difficult. So for example, when we train machine learning systems, we had this notion of in-domain and out-of-domain, and within distribution and out of distribution. So if you have a certain set of examples that are approximately in some domain or in the distribution, and if I want to suddenly make a prediction way over there, which is completely out of all of the data I've trained the model on, that's just a bad idea. And There's no way to predict whether the model is going to do well over there or not, because it has no information about how the system functions over there. It has information here and it can make extrapolations here, but not over there. But this is something that is difficult to kind of translate over to a large language model, simply because we don't know what that underlying distribution is, simply because we don't know what data they've been trained on, and for good reason. There's a lot of money that goes into this, and companies have a good reason to keep that private. But what that means is we're not sure which domains we should be using this model in and when we shouldn't be using it. And the second aspect of it is what I said in terms of how we structure the prompt. It needs to be explicit, it needs to be very clear, and it needs to be detailed. If we assume that this is a system that has some inherent intelligence or reasoning capabilities, and we prompt it in such a way that we assume that this reasoning is going to kick in and it's going to fill in the gaps like another individual would when we have a conversation, then we are setting ourselves up for failure, because that isn't how these models work. They work in this mechanism of extracting what is required from the prompt, drawing priors from the information that they have, and putting those two things together to provide an answer. So we should be aware of the priors. Where is it that they're getting that information from? And just imagining the web is a good way to go, because that's really the information they're trained on. And the second part is the prompts that we provide. So if we're aware of these two extremes and how these two things can come together, then we will be able to interact with them in ways where, if it's very specialized medical information, we know that this isn't available openly on the web, and therefore I should need to be careful. And at the same time, if it's very complex multi-hop reasoning that requires putting together different information, we're not going to rely on a model to do that. Instead, we're going to explicitly require the model to do the individual steps and then to stitch it together. And therefore, there's much lower chance of hallucinations.
Okay. And you were saying that, your research points is that, okay, we shouldn't be scared, right? Those kind of latent hazardous abilities are probably not something that is going to lead to the destruction, at least of the world, at least for now. Yeah. But at the same time, right, in the field where I am, which is innovation, I work specifically within the life science, medical field, medical devices, pharma, etc. And if you talk about advanced reasoning, right, planning, and all that, those are some really highly sought out qualities that people would like to have when they're trying to work around innovation, right? So I know does the fact that I guess LLMs do lack these sort of emergent abilities that are associated with these concepts, does that make them, does it limit their potential of generating true innovation or true innovative concepts?
Yeah, I think it does. I think so. And also, I think I need to differentiate between AI in general and large language models. Because I hope, and I have no evidence for this, and that is, I think, the crux of what we're saying, which is that we may be a little premature in being afraid of this eventuality where these models can reason and plan. But like you said, it is a sought after kind of ability, and maybe there's some advantage to having these systems which can then provide individual tutors, because in my head that's a dream. Like I imagine someone sitting in the global south with a system they can interact with and learn from, where they don't have access to a teacher, where there's people who don't have access to, let's say, specific healthcare related information because it's taboo and no one wants to talk to them about it, who can then interact with the system and get that information. And that is something that is a worthy dream, and I want to do that. That's why I'm in this field, really. But I think LLMs aren't the way to go towards that direction. And I think our research shows that scaling up these LLMs indefinitely still doesn't allow for it, because the mechanisms that we identify mean that it's the same primary mechanism that's going to kind of continue going through as we scale these models up. They're not going to change fundamentally, and they're not going to do anything different from extrapolating from pre-training data. So what are the kinds of, and I've been asked this, like, what can you give us an example of the kind of idea that, an LLM may never come up with? And yes, right, I mean, the idea of evolution, what Darwin proposed, right? It was fundamentally different from everything that was believed at that point, right? This was a fringe idea that somebody came up with, and then they defend it. And it's the same with, the notion, the Galilean idea of planetary motion. Up until that point, people believed that the Earth was the center, and then Galileo fundamentally changed that around. That isn't the kind of thing that you can extrapolate from pre-training data, because there's the idea that, oh, everything that we do is extrapolation. I see a host of information, and creativity is just a short jump from that. I think that is an understatement of the beautiful human creativity that we have. I think it's way more than that. And I think it's surprising how often we may be making those jumps outside of what is the typical norm, right? And I think we do that surprisingly often. Even the notion of democracy, it was a step change in the way things happen. So this isn't just a purely scientific idea. It's a scientific, political, artistic idea where there are these fundamental changes that people make. And I think we do that on a regular basis, in a very small, in our own really small ways. It doesn't have to be this, incredible discovery. It's just all the little things that we do are fundamentally different from what prior experience and what we call just, Bayesian priors that we extract from our experience would suggest we do. We do things different from that. And that's what makes us who we are, makes humanity what we're capable of. And I think that simplifying that to just generalizing from pre-training data is not ideal. And I hope we move towards that. And I think there's a lot of work, you're right, and there is a lot of work in that direction. There are reasons to be looking at it. And I do hope it happens, but there's no evidence that it's going to happen. LLMs do not add to any evidence. It's like looking at a calculator and saying, oh, one day machines will take over. But that there's no evidence from a calculator to make that jump. Similarly, there's no evidence from an LLM to make that jump.
Okay. And I know it's something that's came after your research was published, but I was curious because when OpenAI came out with their latest model, the GPT-01, where their main selling point is, hey, now it has advanced reasoning abilities. I guess, what does this mean in the context of what we've been discussing?
So I think what it means is that models. So there's no doubt that O1 is better than previous generation models. We really don't know how they work. There are some hypotheses in terms of what they do, and the well-known kind of notion is that they generate what are called chains of thought, which is basically intermediary rationales to reach an answer, and they generate several of them. We again have no idea, hundreds, possibly thousands, and then they look at all of those, or the model looks at all of those and picks the answer that is generated most often. So it somehow maximizes over all of the reasoning paths that it generates. And you can immediately see how this will lead to robustness. This is also similar to what we would have typically in machine learning, which is if you make predictions over and over and over again, it's called ensembling, wherein you pick the most common output and choose that as the answer. And it's likely to be more robust because there were different kind of initial states which kind of reach that same final state. So it's possibly the more likely one. And that is possibly what these models are doing. Again, like I said, we don't know for sure. But what does it mean? Well, it means that they're still following that same underlying principle, which is, you have a model that the prompt is shaped into this kind of idea of what needs to be done. It's explicitly set out. And then those outputs are generated. Yes, when you generate rationales, they become slightly better. And then when you generate thousands of these rationales and average over them, you become even better. But we're not moving towards a step change in the way these models work or in terms of reasoning, as it were. And these models also hallucinate. Even after all of the thinking that they say they're generating, even all of that, they hallucinate. There's planning that they fail in. There's been tests that have been run on these models in terms of O1. I forget the name of the paper, but very recently there was a paper that came out which showed that there was this deterioration in terms of what these models can do as well. So fundamentally, they follow the same pattern.
And I think you were touching a little bit on this before, and And I've been reading some research on the topic, and one thing that have stood out has been some publications where exactly they try and look into innovation, right, and how people, I know how much more innovative they can do whenever they have access to these tools. And I think there's been a lot of mixed results in the literature, right? There was one research I came across from Jeremy Utley. He's a co-founder of the Stanford Master of Creativity, and he has a recurring innovation class where they introduced ChatGPT at some point, and we're expecting to see a huge boost in the output of their classes, right? Not just in terms of volume, but also quality.
Yeah.
And then the results were just, I think he called them disappointing. Yes, there was an increase. The number of ideas it didn't increase by that much compared to the students that were not using ChatGPT. And then, sure, I know the ideas there were fewer bad ideas, but there was just more average ideas, right? And so, they were initially a bit baffled, like, hey, we thought this was a game changer, on our innovation fields, but it didn't really turn out to be that way. And I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts on here. It's like, where's the missing potential?
I think we've seen results that are kind of similar. We worked with this extremely large international ad agency, and we did pretty much the same kinds of examples. We were trying to see if they can come up with fundamentally new and catchy ideas for advertisements. And these were creatives who have extremely long number of, they worked on this for years, so they understand how advertising works. And they were provided with the latest models, and there was a control group that was not provided with these models. And we came across pretty much the same idea. In terms of generation of novel content, these models were severely lacking. And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is, if you think of the model as extrapolating from pre-training data, which is the data that's available on the internet. So if they draw priors from that and they extrapolate from that, then of course, novel idea generation isn't something they can do. Now, we can tweak around with the parameters and make it generate absurd ideas and have a human pick a good one amongst them. But it turns out, even so, the ideas that they generate aren't fundamentally new or exciting. But what we can do, it doesn't mean that these models are completely not useful. We can do something else. What they're really good at is picking winners based on a host of ideas. So if you had people just generate a huge number of ideas, and this is something that we experimented with, and then you have the language model provide feedback on it, and we go back and forth, now that becomes really powerful. And this is because these language models, you can think of it as a system that has access to the entire web and what works and what doesn't work. So it can give you more of what's already out there, or it can tell you based on your idea and based on what has happened in the past, how likely your idea is to be, given all of the history, whether it's going to be catchy or not. And all of a sudden, if you just turn them around as not an idea generation system, but an idea filtering system, now they become really powerful. And I think that is the way I would use these systems in terms of idea generation.
And I think that's a great point, because it comes to mind another paper I've read. It has a nice title called "Ideas Are Dimes a Dozen," and I think their concept was they were looking to see, hey, how well can once more students with these systems generate ideas for consumer goods below $50, right? And here the results were pretty good, right? And one of the potential reasoning that the researchers brought up was that there's a lot of information about products below $50 that have done well, or ideas that have been put forward for that purpose. But then to me, it always comes down to, okay, so then what about the next surgical tool, right? Or the next module for point-of-care diagnostics, or the next, molecule that is really going to be able to, lead with a target in a way that has not been considered before, right? So, how else do you see, these systems being used for really disruptive innovation outside of areas where we know for sure that they have enough data to be trained for? Because I think even the example you were giving before, it still means that okay, there needs to be a lot of data there. How can we go beyond that, or can we even with these systems?
I mean, I think there might be ways of doing it, which is if we have limited data and we understand how we would generalize to new ideas from there, we could provide them as in-context examples to the system, which is we would say, here's some data, or here's a scenario, here's a specific instance we're looking at, here's the details of the medical device, we're interested in creating it, here's the relevant information. And this is an innovation that was seen previously, which made a difference. Based on this information, we would try and get the model to now generalize and create other novel extensions of it. The way I would think about it is, what is the data that one would take to plug into a traditional machine learning algorithm, and what would we train it on in the hope that it would generate several more novel ideas that we can then move through and kind of select from. And if we kind of use that same notion and plugged it into a language model, what it would mean is taking the relevant data, putting it into the prompt, showing examples of good innovations from the past, and then letting the model generalize and to generate novel ideas. Because now what we're doing is, instead of allowing the model to reach into its information source, which is the web, we're kind of directing it into what we provide in the prompt. And now that is a fixed set of information that it needs to reach into and it can extract from. And now that becomes really interesting, because based on that information, it can generalize to specific to the use case that we're interested in, which may not be something that's generally out there. And I think now models have this massive context length, and therefore they can definitely be used in this way, which is really good.
One concept that also, I know it's always very interesting to me. I feel that it's sometimes where some of the most interesting innovation comes from, because I see great innovators sometimes, and are the ones that are capable of really making these connections that were not there before, right? You've brought up a few great thinkers from history, and I think that probably happens a lot of times at smaller levels. We don't always really appreciate what happened, but someone that looked at a particular material, right? And it was like, okay, I think this actually is going to behave in this way if I put it on, on this context, right? And then now they created a whole new, field, a whole new way that something works. And to me, that's the most difficult innovation to really be able to do, having this kind of multidisciplinarity ability. Some people just call it the gut feeling, but it's typically deeply rooted in a fundamental understanding around a lot of different topics.
Yeah.
And I guess my question for you is, can LLMs help us in some way, for this type of innovation, or no, or it's not maybe where they can really help us move the needle forward?
I don't think LLMs are designed for this. I mean, I know that there's hope that they're working in a way that allows us to do this. But if you think about it, if LLMs were able to do that, then they would pose an existential threat. So fundamentally, I would think that LLMs are not capable. There's no evidence that we've seen in all of our experiments and we work continuously with the latest models, including O1 and O1 which reasons and so on. We've run them through a host of tests, and we have about 5 PhD students who are working on different elements of this. And consistently, we have found that when we look at something, they could generate the odd novel idea, because when you generate a host of something that's just like the previous thing, some of them are kind of novel, and maybe you had a human sifting through all of them, they could identify a couple that have a little bit of potential. But like you have found, and like we have found in all of our experiments, fundamentally novel ideas isn't something that LLMs can do. And I don't think it's something that LLMs will ever be able to do. That's not to say AI will not be able to do it. I think artificial intelligence in general, hopefully, and I dream that we move towards that point where it can do that. And we're possibly a decade or so away from that. It's not something that's around the corner. It's not something that current generation systems can do. And what's worse is that there's no evidence that scaling these models up, making them larger, training them on other modalities such as vision and videos and so on, there's no evidence that any of that helps in moving in that direction.
Okay. And so, I know, maybe to close things out, what will be your final advice for companies that want to leverage these models towards innovation, right? What should they be really looking into or looking to try and do with these models to leverage it the most, and avoid, let's say, some of the issues that we've discussed before with bad prompts leading to hallucinations, etc.
I think it's about knowing that they're not reasoning, knowing that they're not doing any novel kind of innovative reasoning or even systematically reasoning. They're generalizing from this corpus of data that they were trained on, and that is significant. Drawing priors from all of the web is extraordinarily powerful. That isn't something to understate. I'm not saying that language models can't do much. They're incredible, but they're not reasoning at that level, and I think that's important. And I would think that for the moment, we as human beings can do a far better job of novel, innovative thought than language models can. But what they are good at is verifying those ideas. So if I had somebody just, I would think that having a system that you run ideas past so that it kind of says, yes, this seems like a good idea. Oh, have you thought of these other kind of directions? Because, when we are tired, when we've been doing this for a while, we may forget certain avenues of exploration. Having a language model kind of drive us in those directions and say, hey, have you thought of this eventuality? Have you thought of maybe using this in there? What happens when you take this idea and plug it in with that other idea or in that other domain? What happens then? Allowing the model to drive us instead of us driving the models. So instead of thinking of us as the drivers of models innovation, if we can think of them as something that will systematize the way in which we innovate, or generalize and allow us to think in directions that we may forget, not because we don't know that we should do it, but because when we're doing all of the work that we do, sometimes we forget some directions. And what does that mean? Well, we don't have to send all of this data out to these massive companies. We can have models like the latest generation edge devices that are in our own labs that we can interact with, allowing us to change the way we think, change the ideas that we have, and really a driver, like a co-pilot in the original sense, not as a sense of us directing the models, but as being able to rely on offloading some of the burden of remembering everything to this system, and not thinking of it as a system that we probe and it does everything for us.
That sounds great. Well, Dr. Madabushi, it was great talking with you. It's been a pleasure. I've learned a lot, and have the rest of a great day.
You too. Thank you very much for having me.